All right. Hey, if you're watching us live, put in the chat where you're watching us from. And if you're watching a recording, welcome to Noble Warrior. My name is CK Lin. Noble Warrior is where I talk to thought leaders and practitioners about their journey from being a burnout overachiever to a noble warrior and reclaim their deep joy and purpose so you can do the same. My next guest is a best-selling author and a scholar. He's an expert in the Eastern contemplative traditions and Western psychology. His latest book, The Dharma in Difficult Times, is a sequel, the sequel to the best-selling book, The Great Works of Your Life. Please welcome Stephen Cope.
Hey, CK. Lovely to be with you.
Thank you so much for being here, Stephen. Oh, by the way, one thing I forgot to mention. If you like what Stephen is saying at any point, go to his website, stephencope.com. We can get all his books, all his courses, and his future retreats.
Yeah.
I wanted to make sure that people get that. Yeah. So you have spent years thinking about, talking about, writing about Dharma. So it's a word that perhaps not a lot of people understand. So maybe we start there, the definition of Dharma, then we can go deeper into your seminal books and ideas.
Yeah, no, CK, that's a great place to start. Because Dharma is actually one of those many layered words in Sanskrit that you'll often hear it mean truth, path, law, teaching. But in the yoga tradition, and specifically in the Bhagavad Gita, about which I write, it means sacred duty or true calling. Dharma, the notion of Dharma is several thousand years old. It goes all the way back to the Vedic times in India, 1500 BCE, and particularly to a wonderful story about a myth really about the god Indra. So Indra was the great thunderbolt god back in the Vedic dispensation in India. And it was said that he had cast a vast net over the entire universe from his home on Mount Meru. These gods always live on mountains, so he lives on Mount Meru. And he cast this vast net over the entire universe. And at the vertex of each warp and woof strand, there's a gem, there's a jewel. And it's that jewel's job to hold together that part of the net. So that if everybody does their calling, their job, the whole thing is held together. And all you have to do is hold together your little part of the web. You're not responsible for the whole thing, but you are responsible for your part of it. The word Dharma actually is based on the Sanskrit root dhr, which means holding together. So from the very beginning in this myth, you have this beautiful idea that individual fulfillment and the common good arise together. So that as I do my deepest calling of my soul, it's also got a common good. It's got a social good. It's pro-social behavior. That idea percolated and bubbled through the whole yoga tradition until about the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era, when it was written down in the Bhagavad Gita, the great text that I love and have written about quite a bit. So that's kind of a basic notion of Dharma.
Yeah, I appreciate you're giving us a Cliff Notes version of it. I wonder if people even know what Cliff Notes is still. But anyways, really appreciate that. Really appreciate that. So this is the Noble Warrior, where we do talk about purpose and Dharma quite a lot. And one thing that I see people commonly experiences is anxiety, this grasping for what's my purpose? What's my one thing? Right? If I'm not doing that thing, then I have quote unquote failed in life, so to speak. They may not say those words, but that's the source of an anxiety, right? They're grasping for the thing. And I think your books rather, offer them some guiding light. So what would you say to those people who may feel this very maybe low grade, maybe high grade anxiety of how do I find my purpose? Oh my
Yeah.
gosh, if I don't have it, then my life is a fail.
Yeah, it's such a good question, CK. So the notion of Dharma itself has tended to promote this idea that we have one calling in this life and we have to find it and do it. And the truth is that Dharma is really more fluid than that. Dharmas arise, come to fruition, and pass away. Dharmas change. It's possible to have more than one Dharma at the same time. There's a very pernicious thing I call the romance of Dharma, which is that in order to find your true calling, you have to leave your job selling insurance and move to Paris and paint, right? So that's the romance of Dharma. Now, that may be the case. You may have to go to Paris, but most likely, most people are already mucking around fairly near their Dharma. Most of us already found our way into the right church, as if you will, and we're looking for the right pew within the church, right? So it's important not to get too grandiose about this idea of Dharma. It's very practical, and it's good and it's right that people should have some little amount of inner anxiety prodding them toward finding what their most authentic calling is. Henry David Thoreau said, one should always be on the trail of one's deepest nature because it is that connects one to the divine. So what you see in Thoreau's teaching there is the connection between your idiosyncrasy, your particularity, and the divine, right? You connect to the divine through your own particular nature. So maybe it's building stone walls, or maybe it's being a CEO, or whatever it is. You know what it is inside. There is a spiritual connection in there that you need to find, and it's that connection that we're constantly on the trail of, right? I've been studying this for so many years, and right now I'm in this in-between state where I'm not 100% sure that I'm spot on my Dharma. So with all the students out there, I'm in the same state. Like this process takes constant discernment, right? Thoreau said you should always be on the trail of your true nature. And he uses the image of the hunter, right? The hunter sits and waits motionless with every sense awakened, waiting for the prey. Maybe that's not the best image, but when he uses,
we got what you're saying. It's okay.
uh,
Yeah. Presence, right? Paying attention.
paying attention, discernment,
Mhm.
always on the trail of one's true nature. I love that, and it's true. I'm a writer, and when I discovered that was one of my most true callings, I found out that I get what I call Dharma assignments.
I like that.
Yeah, which means that it takes a while, but a book will cook for a while in my head, and maybe two. Now, if I removed this screen, you'd see a big bulletin board with two different books mapped out on it, right? I'm not sure which one I'm going to write next. I'm not sure which one is my Dharma assignment, like which one the universe wants me to write. And it's a process of sitting with it, praying, meditating, listening. And eventually one will come to the fore. And then once I get my Dharma assignment, then my whole life becomes unified around doing that. And it's a lovely phase of the Dharma process is when you have what I call certitude, when you know, like I will be willing to bet that Noble Warrior podcast is your Dharma right now. And so you can have certitude. Certitude allows us to unify all of our actions around what we know is our Dharma. But there's another phase of Dharma, which is murky. There can be fallow periods. There can be
A what period?
Fallow, Fallow. That's
Yeah,
an
what's that I mean?
it's an agricultural term.
Mm,
I grew up in the Midwest in farm country, and
mhm,
um, farmers every couple of years would rotate some of their fields out of production. So they would
mhm,
sit fallow. And in that fallow period, when nothing was happening in the field, actually a lot was happening. It was cooking with bacteria and nutrients and so forth. So we can have fallow periods. We can have periods of confusion and doubt. Um, Most people think the process of Dharma is just one of knowing and going.
mhm,
There is that phase, but there's this other phase where you're really your Dharma, if you will, in that phase is really searching and
mhm.
making that a priority. So I just happen to be in that phase right now, and
Yeah,
maybe in a month I'll be in certitude. I hope so because I actually prefer that.
yeah. I really appreciate you saying that, being open about that, because I mean you're a teacher, right? But we are all humans.
Um,
And for me, the dream is there's some the sky parted, and here's like the thing that you should do, and then
right.
you do that thing and life would turn out just the way it's just gonna walk on clouds, so to speak.
Yeah,
That's the fantasy.
that's the fantasy.
But in reality, I really love the way you said it. There's a fallow period where you're searching, you're paying attention to everything, and then there's a certitude period where you're just certain you're taking inspired at all times. And then to me, my personal journey has been, I don't know if you know this writer, David Perald.
Mm.
He introduced an idea of a printer method versus a pixel method.
Oh, no, actually, I don't know that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
I really like that the
Mm,
visual, metaphors of it.
mhm.
So he said, when you do things, there's certain times for printer method where each line is perfect, and
Yeah,
by the line that
yeah,
and by the time the printer is done, ta-da, you have a perfect thing.
yes.
And then there's the pixel method where it's blurry in the beginning and then eventually gets more and more clear over time.
Oh,
And
great.
my fantasy when I was growing up is everything should be the printer method.
Right.
If I'm not clear about this thing, then I just keep doing the thing.
Yeah.
But then in reality, for me, life is more like pixel method. It's kind of cloudy and not really sure, and I'm, getting more and more crisp. And to your point, Noble Warrior has been that dharmic path for me.
Mhm.
I wasn't really sure what the whole thing is about. I just wanted to talk to really smart and motivated, thoughtful people, and then, you get more and more clear. And where this will go, and to be really frank, and make it public, I don't
Mm,
really know. But as long as I'm enjoying it, and I hope my guests enjoy it, and I hope my audience enjoy it, this depth of conversation, I'll continue to do this because I trust that is part of my dharmic path.
and trust is so much a part of it, right? There are little leaps of faith involved in this process all the time, because um, certitude is not really the common mode. There are times when we have to make little leaps of faith. If you look at my first book on Dharma, for example,
Mhm.
you'll see that Robert Frost, for example, great American poet that I write a chapter about, um, he knew what his calling was at 18. He knew he was called to be a poet, but it was absolutely antithetical to everything his WASP family thought. Poetry was not a job, it wasn't a profession. So everybody kept pushing back against him. And you can see in his career how he makes little leaps toward it. They're small steps. So at one point, he decides he'll teach because teaching will allow him to do some poetry. And then at another point, he decides a big move. He's going to leave teaching and buy a farm. And actually, his idea on the farm is to write poetry, not really to farm. And then at a certain point, he decides to go to England, marking his full decision when he was 38 to become a poet. he took many little steps, and each one felt like jumping off a cliff, right? When you look back, this is my experience, at those jumping off the cliff moments, it was actually just stepping off a curb. It wasn't as big as you thought it was.
Mm-hmm.
But you talk about trusting, and I love that word because it's definitely involved in Dharma decisions. Little acts of faith and trust that move you toward the Dharma.
So on that note, I'm a, let's see, how should I phrase this? Recovering perfectionist, recovering burnout overachievers. When I talk about burnout achievers, I'm not talking about someone else. I'm talking about me. This is my journey. So, so I have really struggled with following the mind, which is like logical, data driven, to trust, where there's no data, you just have an intuition, you have an idea, and you have faith that things are going to turn out. So, and I'm making it personal, but I'm using myself as an example, but really I'm speaking to a lot of other people who listen to this, is how do you then discern, how do you make that jump? Because to me, it sounds simple when we say this, just trust. But I don't know if I'm projecting, but it's like effing hard. Like that little trust, just everything's gonna turn out. So can you double click on that a little bit more? How do you do that?
Yeah, well, this is why I love the Eastern contemplative traditions, because they discovered that there is a part of the mind that can be systematically cultivated. So the first thing we encounter in the mind, and what people usually refer to, is ordinary discursive mind, the surface of the mind, what most of these traditions call puppy mind or monkey mind. It's kind of crazy. Ordinary discursive mind is all over the place. It's restless, it's easily distracted, and so forth. Yogis and the contemplative traditions discovered there is this deeper part of the mind. And the nature of this deeper part of the mind is knowing. When I use the word know here, I don't mean do you know your state capitals. I mean this intuitive sense of knowing. It's called vijnana. The mind knows with greater, vaster depth and perspective than our ordinary Western mind, what we might call the ego. And almost all of contemplative practice is actually meant to connect us with that part of the mind. And that part of the mind is powerful in discernment, in discerning what the truth is, how it really is, right? So my whole career has been spent practicing deep yoga and meditation and discovering the way in which that connects me, aligns me to this whole deeper part of the mind. And the experience of this deeper part of the mind, as you well know, is it's not my mind, it's the mind. It's a greater mind. It's the mind of all beings. So in developmental psychology, we go from this tight grasping to I, me, and mine, to opening that up to the deeper parts of the mind. And for years I led this institute at Kripalu, our research institute, and we did some very interesting brain studies that show that adept meditators and adept yogis have a higher connection with something called fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence is the Western way to begin to talk about this mind. Fluid intelligence is putting things together creatively, using all parts of the brain at the same time. It's the leading edge of this deep part of the mind. And so when Thoreau says you should always be on the trail of one's deepest nature, how? Well, precisely by getting quiet and listening and connecting to this. That's what he did at Walden. He went to Walden for 2.5 years, Walden Pond, to get quiet and to meditate and to tune in. right? And he did tune in. He tuned into nature deeply, deeply, deeply. And I know you're into nature and
My medicine specifically. Yeah.
plant medicine specifically.
Hmm.
And Thoreau was the great genius of plants. He discovered plants that nobody had ever seen before in the West, simply by his attunement to the forest and the genius of the forest.
Mm.
So when we talk about trust, we must talk about discernment. You begin to really trust the discerning mind. And that
Mm.
means what we in the West call intuition and
Hmm.
hunch and answers to prayers and synchronicities. You know, there are all kinds of little um, uh, there are all kinds of little opportunities daily where we get messages about which direction we're supposed to go.
Do,
And
do you
with,
mind if we double click on the surface mind versus the
mm,
deep mind? Because I don't
sure.
get a lot of chance to talk to someone who deeply study this
Mm,
and then who teaches it. So,
yeah,
and I do have conversations about this all the time, but I don't get to talk to a scholar who studies this, right?
yeah,
Um, so I'll use my metaphor, and then we can double click on how do we discern the
yeah,
two, if you don't mind.
no,
So the way I think about the mind is the infinite expansive snow globe,
yeah,
right? The mind continues to create content. The snowflakes that flares about, and what and there's a law of impermanence. If I focus on a particular snowflake, it disappears. A la, a key principle that I learned in Vipassana.
mhm,
And plant medicine for me shakes the snow globe a bit so I can see the subconscious, the deeper layers more readily. And then I can choose to focus specifically on a persistent snowflake that doesn't go away even though I pay attention to it.
mm,
Maybe like a childhood trauma or a thing that,
mhm,
that just really irritated me or whatever the reason, right? So that's why I really like the plant medicine work, because it is stillness. Let's see, how do I say this? How do I say this? I get to release
mm,
persistent snowflakes or charges
mhm,
during that process. And then afterwards, um, in that stillness of basically nothingness of the mind, then intuition or truth or knowing comes through. So for me, it's a practice of me discerning truth and illusions that I have.
mhm,
That's why I like that particular process. So I want to double click in with you about how do you discern the surface mind, the
mhm.
chatters, the monkey chatters, and versus the deep knowing um, of the two states.
So luckily, the great Eastern traditions have laid this all out with a great deal of detail. So
Mm.
ordinary discursive mind is colored by three things:
Hmm.
colored by grasping,
Hmm.
aversion, and delusion. You're a Vipassana practitioner, so you know this. So um, there are a number of ways we can tell when we're working from ordinary discursive mind, because it's colored by greed, hatred, or delusion. Um, and when the mind, let's take grasping for example. Um, Grasping. So let's say you and I are sitting here, and we're both thinking, "Oh, I have to impress the world with this. This has got to be maybe
Yes.
this podcast is a Pulitzer Prize, right?"
the
Um, I
the Webby Award, which you won before.
that's right. I have got to be brilliant. Okay.
Hmm.
Now what's happened? Grasping has arisen. Okay. And when grasping arises, we're in the thrall of the limbic system of the paleo-mammalian brain, right? Um, and that's a very primitive part of the brain. Grasping, when it arises, actually interferes with subtle performance and connection. So if I let go of my grasping to have this moment with you, be anything other than what it is, if I let go of that, then we can have a really deep conversation. If I'm holding on to some preconceived notion, if I'm grasping for some preconceived notion about how it should look or be, or I'm up here in my self-consciousness, that's part of ego, the capacity to connect with you is interfered with, right? The capacity for both of us to function at our most subtle level. I'll give you an example of this. The way in which we're talking about ordinary discursive mind, the way in which grasping interferes with performance. You're probably too young to know the name Michelle Kwan. Michelle Kwan was a great Olympic gold skater back in the day. And Michelle Kwan had won Olympic gold, I think a number of times. And she was going back to the Olympics again. And there was a lot of talk about how she was going to have to defend her title, right? She's going to have to defend her title. There was tons of pressure. So there was tons of grasping on her part. Along comes her competitor, young Sarah Hughes, who's not been tried or tested particularly in the Olympic stage. And she has this interview where she says, I'm just going to go out and have fun, right? I have no particular anything to defend here. Now, keep in mind, there are two forms of grasping. One is reaching, and the other is protecting. So Michelle Kwan was protecting, right? Grasping. Anxiety, caught up in the paleomammalian brain, the limbic system. Sarah Hughes, freedom, right? Freedom to connect with just her craft. And of course, who won? Sarah Hughes won, because Michelle Kwan, the grasping constricts the mind. It constricts it. And Sarah Hughes didn't have that. So she went out and did a brilliant performance, nothing to protect, and she won. Have I taken us totally off course, or are you with me on this?
Yeah. Continue, please.
So we know that we're in the thrall of ego and ordinary discursive mind when the mind is colored by grasping, aversion, or delusion. Because in those times, there are three characteristics that color the mind. One is the mind is disturbed. If I'm sitting here grasping for some other moment, the mind is slightly disturbed. Secondly, the mind colored by grasping is said to be obscured. That is to say, it's not seeing things clearly, right? When you're grasping for something, I'm sitting on the couch last night and I know that there's a pint of chocolate fudge brownie ice cream in the refrigerator, right? And all of a sudden, grasping arises, like, oh, I know I just had dinner, but I'm starved. I'm so hungry. I really want that. Wanting arises. In those moments, am I making a discerning choice about that chocolate fudge brownie ice cream? Am I seeing it clearly? No. The mind is obscured when it's caught up in grasping. And it's also separate. So it's disturbed, obscured, and it's separate because the illusion is if I get that chocolate fudge brownie ice cream in me, I'll be whole, I'll be better. So these are how you know that you're functioning from this discursive mind, ordinary mind, because the deeper parts of the mind are not colored by these things, and therefore not disturbed, not obscured, and not separate. Therefore, calm, open, and non-separate. Did that make sense?
It does. The visual that comes to mind is the flaring of the snowflakes versus when everything is still. And then I can just discern what's really the whisper, perhaps, of the intuition, right? That the knowing that comes through.
Right. And you know, I'm fascinated by your snowflake imagery.
I made that up. So.
No, it's great. It's really good. I've never thought of that before, but you talk about that one snowflake that's persistent, right? You can identify that. That's so interesting. Because in the yoga translation, that snowflake that's persistent, to use your term, that's what we call a karma that's etched in stone. There are three kinds of karma, right? And karma simply means action. And the cause and effect process of action. It's said that there are three different kinds of karmas that are like lines drawn in water, like lines drawn in sand, and like lines etched in stone.
Mm.
And all of us struggle with that one karmic bondage to something that's etched in stone. And very often that's the work of a lifetime, is to come to terms with that, to recognize that pattern, and to begin to create witness consciousness around it, to begin to surround it with consciousness and awareness. I'm sure this is what you do in your practice with plant medicine, right?
Um, yeah, I mean, I am a seeker at heart. I'm always a student, sometimes a teacher, but
Mm.
always a student. And really want to, through my own suffering, I was seeking a way to have more freedom in my life, more spaciousness
Freedom, yeah.
within the mind, and then live a more embodied life. I think the terms you use is a joyous life or activated life. I can't remember exactly the phrase, but basically a life that I love.
Yeah.
And plant medicine so far has been a very effective tool to allow me to let go of those etched
Mhm.
um, or charges, or those persistent snowflakes, whatever the metaphor that lands for
Yeah,
our listeners here, to really let that go. So then I can free up my internal resources to do things that I love.
that's beautiful. I mean, yes, those karmas etched in stone, um, what they require is that we bring awareness to them, that we touch them with awareness, that we create space around them. We all
Mhm,
have them.
mhm,
And, uh, in many ways, the Western traditions have been perhaps better at helping us with the neurotic mind. Um, the Eastern contemplative traditions are more interested in what I call ordinary happiness. But as far as those items, those karmas etched in stone, this is my experience, right?
mhm.
Begin to fade over time. There's something called fading in the brain, and that means that the neural pathways. Let's say I have an addiction. Okay, let's just take I have issues with food. You can probably already tell because of the chocolate ice cream. I have issues with food, um, and the more I touch that with awareness. So last night I'm on the couch, right, and I'm watching TV, and it arises, and grasping arises, and my practice is really to turn off the TV and connect with the grasping, the craving, the clinging that's arisen. And where is it in my body? And how does it feel? And it gets tight around here and in my throat. Um, the more I can create that, the more I can hold it in a wider consciousness, it begins to disappear, it begins to soften, it begins to fade. And those neural pathways in the brain actually begin to have less charge, fade.
Mhm.
So I think your globe analogy is very apt.
Mm. So double click on the place of knowing, the place of deep,
Mm.
what do you call it? Deep mind?
Vijnana, yeah, deep mind.
Deep mind. Can
Deep,
you describe a little bit more on what that is like? Is it just nothingness? Is it, you're free to swim in the void? Just give us more words so we can get a glimpse of that phenomenon of being the deep mind.
well, there are two kinds of experiences of that deep mind. One is the experience that we have in meditation, right? So there are many kinds of meditation. The Buddha taught 19 different forms. But one thing that's present in all traditions is concentration meditation, where you choose an object, very often the breath, you aim awareness at the object, come back again and again to the object. and the mind begins to stream into the object like a laser, right? So
Mhm.
the mind begins to stream like a laser. And in those moments, Yogi said the mind goes into seclusion. What does that mean? It means the mind has become so laser sharp that thoughts do not actually arise, right? In those moments when we're really absorbed in a state of absorption through meditation, the thoughts that trigger feelings and that trigger karmas simply don't arise. The experience is called seclusion. So I've been practicing meditation for a long time now. I went last night to the center. I sat for an hour and a half. Within about 20 minutes, I'm in a deep state of seclusion, right? And the experience of deep mind there is an experience of profound quiet. It's like being in the depths of the ocean where it's all like totally still and quiet and completely transparent. Um, it has elements of profound bliss and rapture that arise with that stillness. Um, those moments are profound moments because they actually cut the roots, the patterned roots of the afflicted states of greed, hatred, and delusion. They cut the roots so that when you come back and you're in your daily life, you're more connected with the discernment and the wisdom and the knowing of this deep mind. So you make better choices. So if I don't really need it or want it, I don't go to get the chocolate ice cream. I leave it for Saturday night when I have some friends coming over. Um, so there are two ways of experiencing deep mind. One is in the depth of practice, and that can be yoga practice, chanting, mantra, meditation, your practice, I'm sure, with plant medicine has the same qualities. So that's one way. The other is the effect that that practice has on you and your mind in your daily life.
Mm.
My experiences, I tend to become more sensitive, more aware. Um, and these are not quantum jumps, they're very gradual over time. Now, I'm 73, and I implore, I told you this in our pre interview, I, for whatever reason, hang out with a lot of people in their 40s. And I implore my friends to learn meditation. Like, please get yourself a spiritual practice that allows you to deeply connect with this deep mind because it gives you a profound and enduring sense of well-being. Everything
Mhm.
is okay, right? We used to have this
Mm.
brilliant Canadian, well, he was actually an Indian Swami but he was from Canada, and his motto was, "Everything is already okay," and that's the view of a non-dual teacher, right? Everything is already okay. These consistent touching in with the deep mind gives you a pervasive sense in your life. Everything's actually okay.
Mhm.
All okay. Um, and then you begin to live from that center. Um, there's a great quatrain from the Tao Te Ching that says, "The master sees things as they are without trying to change them. She
Mhm.
lets things go their own way and resides at the center of the circle." What's the
Mm.
center of the circle? It's that deep mind that we're talking about. It's that
Mm.
awake mind, that uh, illumined mind, whatever you want to call it. So if the more you live from there, the you'll make better decisions and you'll likely make decisions that lead you to authentic fulfillment.
Yeah. Oh man, so many points rabbit holes I can go down to. Which one to choose? um, well, I mean, let's actually segue to uh your book, your new book, Dharma in Difficult Times. I think that's as good as any. One of the things that I've always been very driven.
Mm,
Maybe that's obvious.
mm,
And thanks to books like yours, um, the great works of our life, and that I became more ikigai, I became more purposeful
hmm.
because now I can articulate, well, what is my overall through line?
Yeah.
What is my North Star? What's my horizon?
Right. Right.
Right. That I may never get there, but that's the direction I'm gonna point my life towards.
Yeah.
And this year has been a pivotal year for me because now I found joy.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
how do I do it with joy versus just, this white knuckling, I gotta do it, I gotta do it,
Yeah.
the kind of experience. So joy.
Yeah.
So my mantra has been only joy, only joy. Solegria. I learned this from the Brazilian. Solegria, only joy, only joy,
Yeah.
only joy. So that's my anchor point.
Right.
So Dharma in difficult times,
Mhm.
circumstances may not be so great, or the subjective experience may not be so great. It doesn't feel quite comfortable. So during those times, what creeps in, even for people who are trusting and who are following their Dharma, is, am I on the right path? Doubt
Mm,
or hesitation? So
mm,
can you double click on those times when, as you mentioned earlier, things is a little murky. I don't feel comfortable. I don't have that certitude. I've always have. How do I move forward? Continue to walk the path of my dharma, and continue to trust and continue to have joy.
wow. Okay, that's a lot. I particularly. Let me circle back to joy.
Yeah,
Um. Uh. Oh God, I just flooded my mind and I lost the point I was about to make.
it's
Uh,
okay. We start wherever we
oh, I
stop.
know.
It's all
I know.
good. Yeah,
We're going to
great.
talk about doubt. So, doubt is an interesting phenomenon because it's in Buddhism. It's one of the five hindrances. So it's sloth and restlessness, sloth and torpor, uh, grasping, aversion, and doubt. Those are the five hindrances. Um, and you know, I've studied all these great lives in my books. Each of my books on Dharma looks at great lives, and what you discover is that all of these people these great people, and I don't mean by great that they were famous. I meant that they found their Dharma, they found their calling, and they did it full out. They all had periods of profound doubt, right? I mean, look at um, uh, Mother Teresa of India, right? When she died, they found her journals and they were replete with her doubt. Does Jesus Christ even exist? Is any of this true? Profound doubt. Doubt is actually the flip side of certitude in some ways.
Hmm.
Um, the deeper you go into your Dharma, I think the more you're going to have to struggle with doubt. Doubt is the essence of the experience of doubt, right? And I'm in doubt right now. I'm profoundly riven by doubt. The experience of doubt is the experience of being split. And
Hmm.
now I'll be very personal. I'll tell you what my doubt is about because it's interesting. So into my beautifully well-ordered life, right? I love order. I love order. Has come this little puppy. Okay. It's not my puppy. It's my best friend, Brian's puppy. And I fell in love with her. Why? Because
Hmm.
she gives me so much joy all the time. She's just pure joy, right? Now, um, Brian can't take any care of her any longer. So he asked me to take the puppy. But the puppy, having a puppy is like having puppy mind in your house, right? Um, it's it's in so many ways a stretch for me, and it doesn't necessarily support my writing, I've discovered myself to be completely codependent with this dog. I'm constantly worrying about her. Is she happy? Am I giving her enough? Let's get enough
Uh-huh.
quick. So right now I'm stuck on the horns of a dilemma. Like, do I adopt this dog who brings me so much joy that I've never had ever this level? Or what about my Dharma of writing?
Mm.
I don't know the answer. Check with me in a month, but I'm definitely caught on the horns of a dilemma. What does it involve? It involves I like to try things out. So next week I'm going to have a week when she stays here with me to see how it goes. Like, try it on, right?
Mhm.
If you're in doubt, um, pray about it. Listen to your higher power if you have one of those.
Mhm.
Your discernment. Give it time. Right? Very often, the resolution of doubt takes time, uh,
Mm.
and also honor it, because doubt usually arises when something new arises in consciousness, like this dog knocking on the door. Something's knocking, right? Um, Doubt is something new knocking that you have to work through. So let's
Mm.
not demonize it. It's part of the process. You have to learn to work with it. You have to learn to live with it sometimes. Marion Woodman, my good friend, who was a great Jungian analyst of the last century, talked about sometimes you have to hold things in what she called psychic utero. You have to hold these two conflicting ideas in psychic utero. That is, you're going to give birth to something, right? And it's cooking away in there. So right now I'm holding this little dog and my writing career in psychic utero. And very often, I write about this in another book, my book called Soul Friends. Very often, if you stay connected with deep mind, a third way, what psychoanalysts call a third way, will emerge.
Mm.
I can have both the puppy and my writing career at the same time. Third,
Mm.
third way, right? Not an either or.
Mm.
So we have to learn how to use doubt very skillfully, because there's a lot in it. There's a lot cooking away in there.
Mm.
So holding things in psychic utero, I love that. I love Marianne.
I appreciate. Well, thank you for making it personal, giving me a very vivid example, first of all. It could be a puppy. It could be a business idea. It could be two books. It could
Yeah,
be, a romantic interest.
yeah, right.
And then life is full of beautiful blessings and gifts.
Mm,
And hey, here you go. Three things. Which ice cream flavors you want. You're like, oh no, I have I
yeah,
have some difficulties choosing. Yeah, I mean, it's a real thing, and I really appreciate how you said to just sit with it,
yeah.
give it time, and ask, the deep mind, what is it that you want? Perhaps, most likely, probably, always,
Mm,
there is a third solution where you can have it
right,
all, and
right.
it's up to that yourself, the deep mind, to discern on what that is. I would say for me, my in because I'm such a purpose-driven person,
Mhm.
my default unconscious choices pick one or the other.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Absolutely.
but the maturation process for me is, hey, hold on, you don't have to sacrifice a thing yet.
Right.
Sit with it. Maybe a new solution, a new idea.
Absolutely.
Um,
Let it cook. I One of my mottos in life is it never hurts to slow things down. It very often doesn't help to speed things up. So you sit with the not knowing. You make room for the not, wow, I don't know right now. I really don't know. Okay, that's all right. Um, Eventually it will resolve itself. That's why I like the idea of the master sees things as they are without trying to change them. She stays at the center of the circle. So you come back again and again to the center of the circle.
so on that note, let me double click on that. There, meditators, especially people who are on the spiritual path, often opt for stillness. meditation practice,
Mm.
surrendering, flow. Let's just watch and see. And then, but then on the flip side of that spectrum is inspire action,
Mhm.
right? You hear a lot, especially people who all was more the masculine energetics, just
Mm.
do.
Mhm.
So, but I don't think it's one or the other, right? It's finding the harmony point between the yin and the yang. So how do you think about when is a time for stillness
Yeah.
and when is time for inspire actions?
You know, that was the whole purpose of the Bhagavad Gita, this 2,000-year-old scripture. Until the writing of the Gita in the, let's say, the 3rd or the 2nd century BCE, spiritual life was basically a life of asceticism. It was a life of renunciation in India. It was all about quiet, right? It was all about leaving the world behind, leaving the marketplace. This great scripture was the first time you have a scripture that says you can have a deeply spiritual life in the world, right? You can have a deeply spiritual life by living your calling in the world. And in fact, most of us are not going to be monks and nuns. Most of us are living in the world. I certainly am. And so it lays out this 4-stage path for living in the world fully. And this is in my first book on Dharma. Number 1, discernment, discern your calling. And by that, I mean, what's your calling right now? Forget about the notion that we just have one calling. But right now, what's life calling you to? Discern your Dharma. Second, do it full out. This is called the doctrine of unified action. That is, once you know what it is, you bring everything to it. This is where that trust and those leaps come in. You bring it, right? So discern your Dharma, do it full out. The third one is let go of the fruits, right? Let go of the outcome. The outcome is none of your business. You don't even know what success or failure means. Krishna says to Arjuna, it's better to fail at your own Dharma than to succeed at the Dharma of another. But the truth is, we don't know what success really means. So my new book, for example, it's not selling as well as my first book on Dharma. I don't know why. I don't know its true purpose. I got the Dharma assignment. It was clear I was supposed to write that book. I brought everything I had to it. I did it full out. Now I have to let it go. I have to let it go into the world and find its true purpose. Okay, so this is a hard one for Westerners. Letting go of the outcome. I mean, I worked with this group of hedge fund guys, and the idea of letting go of the outcome for hedge fund managers was just crazy. And then the fourth one is
Wait, before you go on to the next one. So what do they say?
um,
Were you able to help them? Like, what did you say to help them let
well,
go a little bit of their attachment?
I was able to show them
Hmm.
precisely that clinging to outcome actually interferes with their performance, even in the financial world. Because clinging to outcome, if you're clinging and grasping and holding on, we've already seen that gives you tunnel vision, that narrows your focus, that eliminates this great fluid intelligence where you open to all these possibilities. So they got that their creativity was enhanced by letting go of their ideas of what a good outcome would be.
Mm.
They totally got it. And this group went on to, some of them wanted to leave the profession, but they went on to stay in the profession. This was after the disaster of 2008 and reform it, right? Because that sector was so involved in the crash in 2008 and 2009. So let's review. Discern your Dharma, do it full out, unified action, let go of the fruits, and then turn it over to God, to higher power, to something bigger than you, to some bigger purpose. And the Bhagavad Gita showed that when you're living that way, according to those 4 precepts, you're actually not the doer of your actions. You're the channel. You're a channel for this deeper mind, for some people would call it God, the divine. But you get to live this amazingly exciting and fulfilled life, and let go of those things that really cause suffering, the clinging and the grasping and the hatred and aversion and so forth.
Mm.
Has this answered your question?
It does. I mean, well, I'm not looking for answers. It's more about just, let's, have a refinement about our understanding of it.
Yeah.
Actually, what you said about letting go, or surrendering, you didn't say those words. I said those words, but
Yep.
that's what I got.
Right.
It reminded me of a high performance coach, Jeff Spencer.
Mm.
He used to be the cornerman for Tiger Woods, Lance Armstrong, Bono, and this type of people. People who are playing on a really high level.
What's his name?
Jeff Spencer.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah.
Yeah, Lance Armstrong. So, and he said, keep a soft focus. He said, you don't want it to be hard focus, because if you keep it a hard focus, all you can see is the thing that you're looking at. You can't see anything else.
That's
You
beautiful.
also want to be too diffusive,
Yeah.
where you can't see anything. You lose your goal. Soft, like keep it there, but keep your peripheral vision there. I really appreciated that articulation.
That's beautiful. CK, do you know that one of the side effects of deep meditators is their peripheral vision is widened?
Mm-hmm.
Anatomically, biochemically, whatever you want to say, they have more peripheral vision, actually. Isn't that interesting?
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean symbolic peripheral vision.
Mm-hmm.
So open it up. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful. I love the soft focus idea.
Yeah. Because when you have soft focus, then you can be aware of the solutions, the third way that you mentioned earlier.
Exactly.
That may be staring at you in the face, but you just are too focused to even see it.
One of my great fun examples of fluid intelligence that we talked about earlier, that we're talking about now too, is Apollo 13.
Mm-hmm.
Remember when they had a disaster on board, and the group of scientists down on Earth had to do all these creative solutions to try to solve the problem that was going on up there.
Mm-hmm.
And it required them totally thinking out of the box, right? And that's characteristic of this mind that we've been talking about. So for several years, I taught a group of brilliant young musicians from all over the world who had come together in this academy here in Massachusetts to study every summer. And they had such a hard focus on the perfection of their instrument and the piece of music that they were suffering profoundly. The grasping to perfection and perfect outcome was so hard. And I taught them the story of Krishna and Arjuna, and they started softening that and opening up. And all of a sudden, it unleashed their creativity. We'll talk about joy, right? So that narrow focus was just widened, and they had this sense of everything's okay, well-being. And so now how do I live in my instrument through that, rather than through holding and clinging and grasping?
So let's talk about that for a bit. When people think about spiritual practice or professional practice, they're thinking, I gotta, really hunker down, and it's about the discipline. It's very serious. My livelihood's on the line. My reputation is on the line. There's a lot of heaviness and significance. And I know that personally very, very well.
Yeah.
and but one realization that I have is, what is it all for if not for joy? So I do my best to bring in the lightness of being, right? To remember that all this is gonna pass, and it's all about enjoying my life. So curious, because you wrote a book about Dharma, Great Works of Our Life. You
Yeah.
wrote a book about Dharma in difficult times. So can you help us bring a little bit more joy into our Dharma work?
Yeah. Um, you know, joy, um, as you probably know, joy is a built-in feature of this deep mind that we've talked about. Um, when the mind settles, these four states of mind, and this comes straight from the Buddha, but it's also in all the yoga scriptures. When the mind quiets and settles, four states of mind naturally arise. One is called metta, loving kindness. One is called karuna, compassion. Mudita, sympathetic joy. And upekkha is equanimity or balance. But together, these are all states of profound happiness, right? And joy. And there's nothing that you have to do to create them. It's a byproduct of practice.
Mm,
Now, it's a complicated thing though, isn't it? Because let's take me. I'm a writer, and I have my motto for myself as a writer is suit up and show up. My
mhm,
agreement with myself is I have to suit up and show up every day, right here in the office.
mhm,
And if I don't feel like writing, I don't have to. I almost never don't feel like writing. I get here and like we're gonna write. So some days are work, um, some days are plodding, other days are just filled with these gifts and joy. And um, Arnold or Copeland, Aaron Copland, the great American composer, used to say, um, "I have to show up in my studio because I never know when the muse is going to show up, and if I'm not there, I won't meet her." Right.
mhm,
So um, I have days that are very craftsmanlike, very workmanlike, plodding, right? My motto in those days is just to move the marbles forward a little bit. My best buddy Brian and I have this. Is in an entirely different business, but we at the end of the day we're like, well, did you move the marbles forward just a little bit? Yeah, yeah, that was good. Um, it's a very craftsman-like approach, but along with this craftsman-like approach comes unbidden waves of deep happiness and joy.
mm,
The, the idea is that in your dharma, remember, you're just doing your little bit, but you're part of building something bigger. You're part of building a good society. You're part of building a good family. You're part of building a great cathedral. And there are moments when you step back and you feel the profound joy in that cathedral, right? Maybe you won't live to see it done, but you feel the joy in your own integrity and participation in that big task. You feel the joy in having been invited into that big task. And I don't mean big, I mean spiritually big, right?
I understand.
Yeah. Um, Thoreau is always my good example on that because he lived such apparently a small life. He said, I have traveled extensively and conquered. Um, but he lived such a big life with such integrity to his own calling that it literally touched the world. And there
Mm,
was a dude that was full of joy, but not all the time. He had a lot of sorrow as well. And sometimes I think joy and sorrow are very deeply intertwined.
mm,
You've had the experience when you're sobbing and you're crying and your heart is broken, but there's also some deep sense of sweetness in it. It's that sorrow is connecting you to maybe a lost person or love or whatever. So I have to be careful around this because people think that contemplative practice is inevitably going to lead to immediate happiness. And and permanent happiness, and that's just not true.
Mm.
But Csikszentmihalyi, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the great
Mm-hmm.
author of the book Flow,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
he did a study of what actually makes people happy and fulfilled. And it was a big surprise to everybody. He put beepers on people, and he did hundreds of subjects. And at the beginning of the study, he asked people when they were happiest and most fulfilled. And to a person, they said, when I'm hanging out with my family, or when I'm in my own personal monogram pool in the backyard, or whatever. And then he beeped them periodically and randomly and asked them about their state of mind in that moment. And what he found was most people were really happiest when they were doing what we would call their dharma. That is, when they were doing some task or occupation to which they felt deeply called,
Mm.
in which they had some skill and something that they could call doing their life work, whether it was raising an adolescent or writing books, as I do. Most people were actually happiest and most fulfilled when they're doing their dharma. And joy arises unbidden, again, it passes away. It arises and passes away. Happiness arises and passes away. What the mind state that's more that stays around more is actually fulfillment, which is different than happiness.
Okay, double click on that. What's the different definition for happiness and fulfillment?
So happiness is a fleeting state of mind that comes and goes, and fulfillment is a deeper ardency. Like, I have this profound sense of having lived a fulfilled life because I took some risks. I did my dharma. I wrote the books. Some of them are bestsellers, some aren't, but I took every dharma assignment and did it. And this leads to a kind of happiness that is not exactly surface, and but it's a deeper kind of happiness, a deeper abiding sense of being filled up, really, even in the midst of a day when nothing goes right and my writing doesn't go well, and yet there's a profound sense still of fulfillment. No, I'm in the right place. I'm in the right church, and I'm in the right pew, and I'm doing it and letting go of the outcome. I don't know. The outcome is bigger than I am. Who knows? Maybe these people are meant to stick somewhere. Maybe they're not. But I know I did my part. And that leads to fulfillment. And it's erroneous and it's misleading for people to think that if I don't get happy right away, that I've somehow failed in my practice. It really doesn't work like that. Happiness is a mind state that comes and goes, and it's lovely when it comes, and when it goes, you learn to be with that and not be aversive to it.
Yeah. Man, again, so many things I can double click on. I need to make a choice. So for me, the metaphor, the difference between happiness and fulfillment is the gratification of eating that ice cream is fleeting, but it's very satisfying.
Right.
And versus eating a wholesome, healthy meal.
Yeah, that's good.
Right. May not have the same peak taste, the
Yeah.
oral pleasures, let's say, but the body is nourished, and then you feel satisfied. It's very, very content from that. I still want my dessert, but nonetheless, the body is very satisfied versus this like sugar high that I'm just trying to chase. So that's a very visceral metaphor.
I like that. There is this distinction in the contemplative traditions between grasping and aspiration, right? Grasping is driven by that squirrel brain, the paleo mammalian brain. It's full of suffering. It's just, it is. where did I just see last night? I was watching something on Netflix, and I was surprised to see very, very adept, I guess it was musicians. Yeah, it was musicians talking about how much suffering they had around their grasping, right? Oh no, here's another secret. I never watched this, but I was actually watching Britain's Got Talent. That's where I saw it. It was on YouTube. So there are two things. Grasping, which can drive you. You can be a driven person, driven by grasping. And many of my young musicians come into me that way, right? And to a certain extent, that grasping has created a lot of excellence and beauty, but also a lot of suffering. So I present to them this alternative called aspiration. Aspiration is more driven by the prefrontal cortex, by the executive functions of the brain. And it says, look, just practice your practice. Do what we call deliberate practice. I sketched that out in the book. Deliberately practice your craft so that you achieve a kind of mastery. And then rather relying on your own emotional state and your wish for greatness or your wish for perfection, rely on your craftsmanship and let it shine. Or if it doesn't shine that day, it's okay. Let it go. Get over it. You know, I write about Marian Anderson and her brilliant concert in 1936 in front of the Lincoln Memorial, where because of racism, the Daughters of the American Revolution would not let Marian, the greatest contralto in the world, Black, would not let her sing in Constitution Hall. And Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was president at the time, said, no way, that is not going to stand. And so they created a concert for her in front of the Lincoln Memorial on Easter Day, 1936. 75,000 people showed up. Right? It was an earth-shattering event. She walked onto, and the event of her life, really, in many ways. She walked onto the stage, and there are all these microphones in front of her from all over the world. This was broadcast everywhere. And you can imagine if she dropped into her fear about, oh my God, she dropped into Michelle Kwan protecting her reputation in that moment, she would have ended up. But she says in her biography, she says, I relied on my craftsmanship. I trained in this way, and I just did what I was trained to do. So letting go of the grasping in that moment, the emotions in that moment, and just relying on craftsmanship, which is driven by aspiration, right? Like I'm a writer, I'm a craftsman. I have an aspiration to write well, to write good books.
Yeah, well, actually, if you don't mind double clicking on that.
Yeah.
What is your aspiration as a writer?
My aspiration is to learn to convey deep truths and deep realities in a way that mainstream folks can really get them. So, you know, I've concentrated on translating, for example, the Yoga Sutra. The Yoga Sutra is a 2,000-year-old, very complex scripture. And I wrote a book called The Wisdom of Yoga, which really, I think, if I do say so myself, very well explained it in almost fictional, in almost the fashion of a novel to a mainstream audience. That's what fascinates me. And by the way, fascination is important because if something fascinates you, you have to follow that up. So I'm fascinated. The first time I read a book that was in the genre that I write, it was by Mark Epstein called Thoughts Without a Thinker. And this was 30 years ago. It was a great bestseller. But CK, it was so brilliantly done. It was so beautifully written. It was so sublimely put together. And I saw that and I said, I want that. I think I can do that.
Mm.
Why I thought that, I don't know. There was no indication. I think I can do that. I saw myself in that. This is called projective identification. I saw myself there, and that became my aspiration. And so I plodded away at it, right? My first book took 4 years. How I had the cojones to even think I could write a successful book, I don't know. I don't know, where did these things come from? Way deep inside. It did. It was a bestseller and still is 20 years later. And ever since then, I've been taking on these more and more complex assignments, Dharma assignments, to write books. The last book also took 4 years, the Dharma In Difficult Times. And it kicked my butt, man. Oh my God, that book put me through a lot. And yet I knew I was doing my Dharma. I had certitude about that. I was bringing unified action. I was bringing everything I had to it. And now I'm letting go of it. Okay. And now I have a couple more books up here beginning to cook. Like what's calling me? And yeah, there you go.
Well, let me just say this. As a fan of your books,
Mm,
that I really appreciate the intentionality behind every sentence, the way it's structured,
thank you.
and how you make it accessible to this very esoteric topic,
Mhm.
Dharma, and also how you humanize these, extraordinary human beings.
Yeah.
Because when we think about, oh, these are great people, they never have self-doubts.
Right.
They never have down times. They're always walking on clouds wherever they go. But that's your books, specifically your book, The Great Works of Our Life, really humanizes these extraordinary people. Like, oh, so they too like human, just like me.
I'm so glad to hear that because that was my intention. Like,
Hmm.
let's get under the hood of these lives. How does this really work? Because keep in mind, most of the people in that book, they weren't famous during their lifetime. Thoreau wasn't famous. I think 800 of his 2000, his first book, I think had a print run of 2000, but in his lifetime, he never sold more than 800, which is not a lot of books, by the way, of Walden, his great masterpiece. Now everybody reads it in college. Everybody, right, all over the world. Most of these people weren't famous in their lifetimes. And it's only in retrospect that we understand the power of living a life according to those 4 precepts. Discern your Dharma, do it full out, let go of the fruit, turn it over to God. Yeah.
So on that note, you are on this path, you're making a difference in your readers' lives in ways that you will never know.
That's right.
Okay, so as a writer, right, let's see, how do I ask this question? Give me a moment. Okay, so as a writer, you could aim to just plant seeds and then whatever happens with the fruits, hey, that's outside of your control.
Mm-hmm.
Or as a writer, you can attempt to give them actionable items, to give them, transformation, behavior shifts, trauma release, like that's a little bit further down the line.
Right.
So what do you aim to do when you write?
So, Emerson said to Thoreau, every sentence should be its own evidence. And that's a packed statement. But what it means, I guess, obviously, is every sentence should be so full of its own power that it doesn't have to refer to somebody else's power. So what I strive for as a writer is to write a book that itself has the power to transform the words. This is what fascinates me. The power of words. When you read, like when we all have books that transform us, and they're not the same books. when I read Mark Epstein's book, my life was transformed by, and I also appreciated the genius and the beauty of his prose and the refinement of his presentation. And it's an art form. So all art forms have their own intrinsic fulfillment. And when you hit it, when you nail it, you know it, right? And every now and then, not all the time, not even sometimes often, I nail it, and it's so fulfilling. So words are really my métier in that sense.
Mm. So speaking of that, the medium of influence is now shifted,
Yeah,
going from words, well, actually all the way back then, just oral traditions to now, short form sound bites, social media. Can you speak a little bit more about how you have to change as a teacher
yeah.
to adapt to the modern times, to the modern taste of our time?
Oh, that's such a huge question. See,
Take
once again, I'm in the middle
it
of
wherever you wanted to go.
it. I am so in the middle of this. So when I my new book is my sixth book, right?
Mhm.
And all of my previous books sold extremely well. The first book, the first three books are all, I think, over 100,000 each. That's a lot of books. Soul Friends, not quite as well. But this book, all of a sudden, it came out and it was like nobody bought it. Not nobody, but maybe we've sold a couple thousand copies. Um, and honestly, I talk a really nice game about letting go of grasping, but it does feel better when people buy your books after you
Mhm,
read them. It
mhm,
feels better, right?
mhm,
So I had to make a choice. And so I consulted some people and I discovered that, oh, the world was changed while I was here writing books. And people's concentration spans have diminished profoundly in 30 years. People need, as you said, sound bites, little videos, all of that stuff. So I had to make a choice. Steve, are you going to try to enter into that domain of social media and marketing? I've never marketed my books ever. Are you going to enter into that, or are you just going to let it go? And that was, I was caught on the horns of that dilemma for a while until I decided, I have some responsibility to a book like a child once I produce it. And so I thought, no, I'm going to hire. So I hired a brilliant woman and firm from North Carolina to do all my social media stuff. Well, I tell you, I never had a Facebook page. I never had Instagram or any of that stuff, Twitter. Well, now I do. And now I do. And I barely know how to get on any of it. Um, and It's an experiment, right? It's an experiment. So right now, to your question, I'm videotaping a 9-session product that will go along with my new book, The Dharma in Difficult Times, that we're going to try to push into yoga studios around the country, because I know that all of us around the country right now are saying, we live in such desperate times in so many ways, with global warming and with political separation and insanity, and with the rise of autocracy, and on and on. We all have to have in the back of our mind the question of, what is my duty? What is my duty in the face of everything falling apart? I know my duty is that gem at the warp and woof strand of Indra's net, but how do I contribute my gifts to the common good right now? I know that's in the back of everybody's minds, and so I'm creating this product that can go out with my book to help yogis in yoga studios and yoga teacher training programs think about these issues through the lens of the Bhagavad Gita, which is the most influential scripture in this regard, having to do with action in the world and the common good. So we'll see. It's an experiment, CK. I don't know. Maybe
Well,
next year I'll be off of that stuff.
well, I'm a fan. I'm gonna send my people to buy your course, to buy your books for
Thank you.
sure.
Yeah,
But I
appreciate it.
do want to do a callback real quick because on
Yeah.
one, what we talked about, the non-dual perspective is everything is fine and nothing to fix. And now you're also saying like, hey, everything's falling apart. So at the surface level, like, hey, wait a minute, Stephen just said this. They seem to be conflicting. Can
Yeah.
you say a little bit more about that? I mean, I know what you mean, but can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. I mean, this is what you've just touched on is a classic debate within the contemplative world. And let's face it, within all religious traditions, the debate between the dual and the non-dual. And the non-dual position is, dude, everything is already okay. All you have to do is understand that, and then everything will be okay. The non-dual position is that no, no, no. Life is a life as a spiritual being is a systematic program of purification, of moral purification, of spiritual purification. There's a lot to do, get to work, right? So these are the two. And back in the Middle Ages in India, all these great teachers had debates, and the debates were usually between the non-dualists and the dualists. And traditionally, the non-dual people always win these debates because they use poetry and imagery and nonlinear thinking, and they walk circles around the dualists, right? The truth is, it's another case of the third way. They're both true, right? They're both true at the same time. And that's how I live really every day. There is I have a systematic path of practice I practice hatha yoga, I practice meditation, I practice chanting, and there is also the daily surrender to it's all already okay. I don't understand how, but there is this profound center of well-being at the heart of me that connects with all beings. They're both true.
I'll share mine. Maybe you can double click on what
Yeah.
my answer may be.
Yeah.
So I'm very much of a Taoist.
Yeah.
Everything is fine, right? It's more fine or not so fine because of someone's perspective, mine, you, whoever. It's a perspectiving that makes it good or not good.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Tall or short, whatever, based on what, right? What's the benchmark? What's the perspective? So there's that. And and the way I think about my dharmic path is, hey, what do I learn? What have I learned that I could share to the younger versions of CK that may alleviate some suffering?
Yeah.
Ultimately, is their path. If they want to suffer, fine, that's okay. But I've done my part to make a thing, an artifact, a book, a video, and it's up to them. I let that go. So that's the way I think about it. Everything is fine.
Yeah.
People are going to be people, and the planet will be fine, quote unquote, long after humans are gone, right? And what could I make because I want to make it as a way to in service of whoever that want to read or watch my things.
It's beautiful. Are you devoted to the Tao Te Ching?
Devotion, that devoted is a strong of a word, but the concept of it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I am completely entranced and charmed and motivated by the Tao Te Ching, I have to say, especially Stephen Mitchell's brilliant translation. And I will tell you that temperamentally, I'm a non-dualist. I always have been. But I also love the genius of no, wait, I said that wrong. I'm a dualist. I said that wrong. I'm a dualist. Really, that's how I grew up. That's just my nature. But absolutely fascinated and intrigued with non-dual wisdom at the same time.
You know what? Now that you mention it, put in those words, I would say I'm very much the same way because
Yeah,
I'm trained as a PhD biomedical engineer.
there
I'm
you
very much a solution-oriented guy. What's the innovation? What's the solution to quote unquote solve this problem?
go. Right.
And through my spiritual practices, plant medicine, Vipassana, Tao Te Ching, all these scriptures, I learned about this subjective reality.
Hmm.
How can I? It's how do I say this? I can get to a place of deep mind
Yeah.
once I integrate all of my charges
Hmm.
of everything is fine, is the way it is. It's based on my perspective and so forth.
Yeah.
So I would say, uh, aspirationally, I like to be more in the non-dual world, but the the training, the programming that I've had so far is
Yeah.
very much of a dualist. How do we quote unquote solve problems?
You know, for me, the dualist approach, which has been the dominant approach in my life, has borne so much fruit. I'm old. I'm 73, and I've practiced since I was 25, and I can see across that trajectory the fruit. I'm in a time of what Jack Kornfield calls fruition. Right?
Mm.
I think he's about the same age. Maybe he's a little younger than I am, but the fruition of practice is profound. So um, having that as my inspiration, the contemplative traditions talk about um, verified faith. Verified faith is faith in something that you have a personal experience of having borne fruit for you. And so I have verified faith in the dualist road. And
Actually, on that note, that's a phrase I'm not so familiar with. Do you mean that you have gone through some personal trials and tribulation to earn that wisdom? Is that what you mean by
yeah,
verify faith?
yeah, you're not so often in our culture when we talk about faith, we talk about trusting in something you don't really know that much about.
Like blind faith?
Yeah, that's right, like blind faith.
Hmm.
But this is faith in something that you have tested and you know it to be true. And back to that sense of knowing, right? Um, so I have verified faith in these practices. It's proven itself out in my life, and uh, you know I'm very aware of. I don't know if you know the work of Teilhard de Chardin, the great French Jesuit paleontologist, but he was a Jesuit. He was a Christian, but also very involved in more in Eastern spirituality. And his view was, and he was a paleontologist, so he was a scientist like you. But his experience of the world was it was filled with miracles all the time, little miracles. And I have that same experience. I haven't always had it. It's the fruit of practice for me. When I practice regularly and stay tuned, little synchronicities, little awakenings, little aha moments, little I don't know miracles. They happen all the time. It's just can you see them? Are you awake enough to see them? And Chardin was you should read some of his work at some point. Brilliant at describing that.
Uh,
I'm aware of the time. I have another call coming in 10
got
minutes.
it. Well, I so appreciate you, Stephen. Thank you so much for your generosity, for just doing your work,
Yeah.
walking your dharmic path. You've been so, so, so generous. For those people that want to buy your course, where should they go?
Just go to stephencope.com. It's my website. And also, if you'd like, go to kripalu.org, kripalu.org. I'm all over that site as well. But you can find my books and my courses at my website. and that'd be great. And also come and visit me at Kripalu. I teach there all the time, and we're up in a beautiful Jesuit monastery on the in the Berkshire Mountains of Western Massachusetts. It's quite gorgeous and stunning. So
appreciate you, Stephen.
My pleasure, CK. Lovely.